They say some stories are meant to stay buried, locked beneath old dirt, rusted nails, and the silence of those too afraid to speak. But this one, it clawed its way back. Tonight we open a chapter that was never meant to be told, a tale whispered through the smoke of the Old South, carried by wind that still smells of blood and magnolia. So dim your light, lock your door, and listen. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed. Not every listener makes it to the end of stories like this, but those who do, you never forget them. The night it began, the air was too still, not the soft stillness of a summer evening, but a heavy, waiting silence, like the breath the world holds before it screams. The fields lay silver under the moon, rows of cane glistening like polished bone. Even the crickets, those tireless mourners of the South, had gone quiet. And in that silence there was a sound. A hum, low, unearthly, like the breath of something that should not breathe. They said the master's hand never trembled. He was a man carved from scripture and cruelty, the kind that saw mercy as weakness and punishment as order. His word was law, his whip, the execution of it. But on that night, beneath the hanging oak lantern light trembling against the bark, his hand faltered once, just once, before the first strike. The overseer noticed. So did the man kneeling in the dirt, wrists bound, eyes dark and steady as the river after rain. "You know why you're here," the master said. No answer. Only that sound again, faint like a voice caught in the leather whispering through the night. The master lifted his arm. The whip glinted in the moonlight, and then it sang, a low, drawn-out tone, pure and wrong like a violin strung with veins. It came not from the air, not from his hand, but from the whip itself. The sound slid through the fields, trembling the leaves, sending ripples through the silence. The overseer blinked. "Sir, that ain't—" "Quiet." The first lash cracked through the stillness. The sound that followed wasn't a scream. It was a sigh, deep, relieved, ancient. The kind of sound a grave might make when opened. The master froze. The whip twitched in his hand. It was warm, pulsing faintly like flesh. He dropped it. The overseer stepped forward, pale. "Sir?" The whip uncoiled on its own, slowly, deliberately. The leather slid across the dirt like a snake, coiling back toward the man on the ground. He didn't move, didn't breathe. The master turned away. "Bury it," he muttered. "Sir, bury it deep. No one touches it again. If you're still listening, you've crossed the line. You've felt the hum too, haven't you? Don't forget to subscribe, because the next part, no one tells it out loud anymore." By morning the fields were quiet again, but in the house, in the study, the whip was waiting and stretched across the desk, slick with dew. The master's signature carved faintly along the handle. Though no one had ever seen him carve, he reached for it. The leather throbbed under his fingers. He pulled back, eyes wide, a welt already rising across his palm. The widow, pale and hollow-eyed, watched from the doorway. "You should burn it," she whispered. "And let it out," he said. "No, it stays where I can see it." That night, thunder rolled over Cypress Hollow. The overseer came running to the porch, rain clinging to his hat, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, the man from last night, he's gone." "Gone?" "Grave's empty. Chains, too." And then, from the darkness beyond the gate, came a sound, soft, measured, like leather sliding over wood. The master opened the door. There it was, the whip, nailed to the front door by a single rusted spike. Blood dripping from the handle, one drop at a time, onto the porch below. The air pulsed with sound and low and rhythmic, as if the whip were still singing, waiting for him to listen. Then a voice, distant, wet with rain and earth, rose from the field. "You know my name." Lightning tore across the sky, and in its flash, a figure stood at the edge of the cane, still, watching, then gone. Only the whip remained, nailed to the door, its shadow twitching in the lightning's glow, like something alive and waiting. They said the master's hand never trembled, until that night when the whip began to sing. And from that night on, the wind never stopped carrying the tune. The dawn came pale and trembling, as though the sun itself feared to rise upon that place. Mist curled through the trees, soft and sickly, wrapping the gallows like funeral cloth. Beneath it the dirt gleamed, dark, wet, and wrong. It pulsed faintly, as though the earth still breathed through the wound. No rain had fallen. No dew had gathered. Yet the soil shimmered with a color too deep for morning light, the color of something freshly taken. The servants were the first to see it. They came before sunrise, lanterns bobbing like lost souls. One of them, a girl named Hester, knelt down with a rag and a bucket, muttering prayers she only half remembered. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered. "It's still wet." Her hand brushed the surface, and the dirt clung to her skin, thick and tacky, refusing to fall away. She tried to wipe it clean on her apron, but the stain only spread in fingers, palms, wrists, blooming like a rose too red to exist. The overseer barked from behind her, "Scrub harder!" And she did. She scrubbed until the rag tore, until the water in the bucket turned to rust, until the sound of the cloth against the earth began to whisper, faint, breathy, almost kind. Hester. She froze. Who said that? No answer. Only the faint movement of the dirt, shifting as though something beneath it was trying to rise. The overseer spat. "Leave it!" But Hester wouldn't. Her hands shook and she knelt again, her breath quick and sharp. The whisper came again, slower this time, thick with earth. "Hester, you were there." The lanterns flickered. The others stepped back. One crossed himself. Another turned away entirely. The overseer cursed under his breath. "Enough, back to the house. I'll send for the preacher." They left the bucket and the rag behind. By the time the preacher came, both were gone. The house itself felt heavier that day. Every window shut, every curtain drawn tight, as though to keep the daylight from knowing what had been done. Inside, the master hadn't spoken a word. He sat in the study with his hands clasped tight, the whip, the same one from the night before, lying on the desk before him. He had not touched it since it was nailed to the door. But now it lay there again, clean and coiled, as if it had never known dirt or blood. The widow entered quietly. Her mourning dress whispered like dead leaves as she approached. "You heard what they're saying?" she asked. He didn't look up. "They say the ground bleeds," she went on. "That it called the servant girl's name." He exhaled, low and shaking. "Lies spread faster than fire." "And yet," she said, "fire leaves ash." "Lies don't." He looked at her then, eyes sunken, rimmed in red. "Do you believe it?" "I believe," she said softly, "that something in that field wants to be remembered." Her voice trembled as she said it, for in her dreams she had heard it too. The sound of earth breathing, the drag of roots pulling through soil, and a whisper threading itself through her sleep. That night, the preacher arrived, pale, sweating, carrying a worn Bible and a flask of something stronger. He went to the gallows with 2 men and a torch. They stood in silence for a long while before he spoke. "Dig," he said. The men hesitated. "Sir, the master, dig." The first shovelful of dirt made no sound. It came up heavy, clumped, glistening like liver. The smell was metallic and wrong. The preacher stepped forward. His eyes darting to the noose swaying above, he began to pray. But the words curdled on his tongue, twisting into something older, something the earth itself seemed to mock. And then the wind rose, not cold but hot, rank with decay, carrying a voice that did not belong to any man still breathing. "You cannot bury what was promised." The torch went out. They ran. The preacher fell once, twice, clawing his way through the grass until he reached the fence. Behind him something wet stirred, the sound of mud being drawn upward, as though forming the shape of a man. When they looked back, the ground beneath the gallows was dry again, bone-white, cracked as if drained of all moisture. But in the preacher's palm blood still clung, sticky, pulsing faintly, as though it knew his name. By morning, word spread. The servants whispered of Hester, how her bed was found empty, her apron folded neatly at the foot. Some said she fled in the night. Others said the earth had opened and taken her back. But those who passed the gallows swore they could still hear her rag scrubbing, faint and steady beneath the soil. The widow no longer went to the windows. The master no longer slept. He could feel it beneath him, the thrum, the slow, patient heartbeat of the field. That evening he found footprints leading from the gallows to his porch, small bare streaked red. They stopped at the door. And nailed to it, where the whip once hung, was a single piece of cloth, torn, wet, and rust-colored. He tore it down, shaking. The smell hit him first, not of decay, but of iron and salt. And then, faint as breath, the whisper again, "You were there too." The master stumbled back, the cloth falling from his hands. He watched as it landed, and where it touched the floorboards the wood darkened, pulsing like an open wound. He tried to speak, but his throat filled with the taste of earth and copper. And from outside, the wind began to hum, low, slow, familiar. The same tune the whip had sung before the final lash fell. By dawn, the dirt beneath the gallows gleamed dark again. Only this time it spread, a trail of wetness leading up the hill, across the fields, right to the steps of the house. Each drop perfect, deliberate, as though painted by unseen hands. And when the servants opened the door to call the master for breakfast, they found his chair empty, his study cold, and on the desk, beside the coiled whip, a single handprint pressed deep into the wood. It never dried. It never faded. And even now, when the wind moves just right through the hollow, you can still hear it, the sound of something being washed that cannot be cleansed, whispering every name that dared to touch it, a stain that breathes, a promise that remembers, the blood that would not dry. It began with a scream that did not sound like it came from a child. It tore through the quiet morning like glass shattering under holy water, high, sharp, and endless. When the servants reached the great hall, they found the youngest daughter trembling before the mirror, her hands clamped over her eyes, her lips moving soundlessly, as though still caught in the moment of her terror. The mirror itself was unbroken, though the glass rippled faintly, as if water still settling after a stone had been thrown. She would not speak for days, but when she finally did, she whispered, "He was standing right behind me." "Who?" the widow asked, though her voice trembled. The child's eyes, pale and distant, lifted to her mother's face. The man with no face, holding the whip. By dusk, every mirror in Cypress Hollow was covered. Heavy drapes, black cloth, even nailed planks of wood. The master ordered them all. No reflection would live in that house again. "Glass holds memory," the old nurse muttered under her breath. "Once something looks through, it doesn't always leave." The widow glared at her for saying such things in front of the children. But in the lamplight, her own reflection, caught in the rim of a polished silver tray, seemed to tilt its head a heartbeat slower than she did. That night, as the house settled into uneasy silence, something stirred in the hall. The candles guttered. The air grew thick, as though the house itself were holding its breath. And then came the soft sound of footsteps, slow, dragging, as if someone walked barefoot across the marble floor, carrying something heavy in their hands. The master opened his study door, a pistol in his grip. "Who's there?" The hallway answered with silence. But as he stepped closer, his own reflection appeared faintly in the black draped mirror at the end of the hall, and though he was still, the image of him in the glass took one more step forward. The servants whispered about the mirrors the next morning, about how, even covered, they seemed to hum softly at night. One boy swore that when he walked past them, the cloth shifted, bulging outward, as though something pressed from within. The widow ignored their talk. She told herself it was nonsense, old superstition, but then she saw it too. In the dining room, she caught the faint outline of a face in the reflection of a wine glass, featureless, smooth, like a doll left unfinished. It was standing behind her. When she turned, nothing. Only the tall window and the magnolia trees beyond, still and silent in the wind, but in the glass. The faceless man lingered a moment longer before fading back into the dark. That night the widow went to her daughter's room. The little girl sat up in bed, clutching her doll, eyes wide open. "He's walking again," she whispered. The widow brushed her hair gently. "It's only dreams, darling." The child shook her head. "No, he walks in the mirrors now. He's looking for the one who hurt him." The widow's hand froze. "Who told you that?" "The man in the wall?" Before she could ask more, a soft sound came from the hall, the faint squeal of a floorboard, the sigh of cloth brushing wood. The candle beside them flickered out, and in the darkness, the widow heard it, a low, steady rhythm, like the slow drag of a whip against the floorboards. By morning, the master's patience had rotted into fear. He ordered the mirrors taken down, broken, destroyed. Hammer blows echoed through the halls, sharp, frantic, each one answered by the whisper of wind through the empty frames. When they reached the great hall, the largest mirror in the house, the men hesitated. It stood taller than a man, framed in gold, untouched since the house was built. The overseer struck first. The hammer met glass. The sound that followed was not shattering. It was breathing. The mirror did not break. It rippled, surface bending inward like the skin of a drum, and from within a shape began to press outward, a hand pale, slick, pushing against the barrier as though drowning beneath the surface. The master fired his pistol. The bullet vanished into the glass, leaving only a faint ripple, and then a thin, wet streak sliding downward like blood. The men fled. Only the widow and the master remained. She stared at the mirror, her breath shallow. "What did you do?" He stepped back, voice cracking. "I buried him. I gave him the earth." The mirror's surface quivered again. From deep within, a voice low and hollow replied, "But not peace." That night the covered mirrors began to move. The cloths bulged and writhed, as though something inside pressed against them. One by one, the nails holding them to the walls began to creak and snap. The servants ran. The children screamed. And through the halls of Cypress Hollow, every mirror began to hum with a faint, wet rhythm, like the cracking of leather across flesh. The master locked himself in his study, pistol in hand, breath ragged. From the corner of the room, the black-draped mirror began to tremble. He whispered to himself, "It's not real." "It's not real," then a voice answered, what his own, echoing from behind the cloth. "No, not real. Only remembered." The cloth fell away, and there, standing behind his reflection, was the faceless man, holding the whip, its handle wet, its length dragging softly against the mirror's edge. The reflection smiled. Though it had no mouth, the mirror cracked, once, twice, and then the light went out. By dawn, every mirror in the house had shattered. The hall smelled faintly of iron. The servants found the master's study door ajar, the floor slick beneath their boots. The pistol lay cold on the desk. The mirror behind it was gone, frame empty, glass missing. But on the opposite wall, where no mirror had ever hung, a faint reflection shimmered in the plaster, a shape like a man standing behind someone unseen. When the widow entered, she froze. The reflection looked back at her. It lifted its arm, on slowly, deliberately, and in its hand, the whip began to move. She turned to run, but her reflection did not follow. It stayed, smiling without a face. As cracks spread through the walls like veins of ice, leading deeper into the house, into the dark, where the mirrors still hummed softly in the dust, waiting for the next one who dared to look. The house had grown quieter since the mirrors broke. Too quiet. Even the wind outside Cypress Hollow seemed to move slower, as if afraid to brush against the walls of a place still listening. The youngest heir, Samuel, had not spoken since the night of the screaming glass. He sat by the hearth, his small hands folded in his lap, his eyes fixed on the wall beside the fireplace, on the cracks that crept like veins toward the ceiling. When the servants asked what he was doing, he didn't look away. He only whispered once in a voice that sounded borrowed, "I'm listening," to the man in the smoke. "He says our names backward." By morning word spread through the servants' quarters like the taste of rust. They said the boy had begun to hum in his sleep, a low broken tune that matched the rhythm of something unseen scraping at the chimney flue. The widow sent for the preacher again. But when he arrived, the boy would not look at him. The preacher bent low, his voice trembling. "My son, do you know the Lord's Prayer?" Samuel nodded once. "Then say it." The boy's lips moved, but the words came wrong, twisted, backwards, syllables curdled like milk left too long in the heat. And when he finished, he smiled faintly, eyes glassy and far away. The preacher crossed himself. "This is not a child's tongue," he muttered. The widow's hands shook as she took her son into her arms, whispering that he's just frightened. But deep down, she knew the boy's fear had turned to something colder, something that waited behind his eyes like a shadow that had learned to breathe. That night the boy refused his supper. He sat in front of the fireplace again, eyes fixed on the flames. The fire burned low, red and slow, curling into the shape of things that almost had faces. The widow stood in the doorway, watching. "Samuel," she said softly, "what do you see?" He didn't turn. "Not what, who?" She felt a tremor pass through her. "Who, then?" "The one who lives in the smoke. He says the house is full of echoes. And we are all only one of them." Her voice cracked. "There's no one there, Samuel." The boy smiled again, slow, knowing. "Then why does he know your name?" The fire hissed. A gust of wind rose through the chimney, bringing with it the faint sound of whispering, dozens of voices tangled together, low and wet, as if the fire itself had begun to remember things it shouldn't. The widow slammed the flue shut. The whispers stopped. But the boy's eyes, they didn't leave the hearth. Days passed. The preacher refused to return. The servants avoided the east wing entirely, where Samuel now spent most of his time. He had taken to drawing on the walls, strange looping symbols like letters reflected in warped glass. When asked what they meant, he only said, "He taught me. He says I must write them down before the ash forgets." The master tried to scrub them away, but each mark left a faint, dark stain that would not lift. By the next morning, the same symbols reappeared, this time higher on the walls, far beyond the reach of a child's hand. That was when they noticed the soot prints. Bare feet, small, leading from the hearth to the far end of the room, where the wall met the floor, and there in the corner. The plaster had begun to darken, black veins creeping outward, pulsing faintly like something alive beneath the paint. The widow sat awake that night, candle trembling in her hand. The rest of the house slept uneasily, but she could hear him, her son, speaking softly to the dark. She followed the sound to the parlor door. "Samuel," she called. The whispering stopped. Only the crackle of embers answered her. She stepped inside. The room was colder than it should have been, though the fire still burned. Samuel sat cross-legged on the rug facing the hearth. His lips moved soundlessly. "What are you saying?" she asked. He turned, slow as a marionette, his eyes reflecting the red light. "He says the fire's hungry," he murmured. "He says it remembers the last time it ate." The widow froze. "What does he mean?" Samuel tilted his head, listening to something she couldn't hear. Then he whispered, "He says it started with the whip." The candle in her hand went out. The next morning the widow found soot smeared across the parlor walls, handprints, small and black, leading up the chimney. Samuel was gone. They searched the entire house, the fields, even the old well by the whipping tree. Nothing. Only silence, until dusk. When the fire was lit again and the smoke began to rise, the servants swore they saw something moving within it, a small shape. Hands pressed against the inside of the flame. Mouth open in a silent cry, the widow screamed for water. They threw buckets upon buckets into the hearth until the flames hissed out, steam rising in a thick, choking cloud. And when the smoke cleared, Samuel sat there cross-legged once more, soot-stained but smiling. "See?" he said softly. "He let me come back." Her tears ran hot and trembling as she held him. "Samuel, what did you do?" The boy looked toward the fireplace, where the embers pulsed faintly like a beating heart. "He says he'll need another name soon." That night the servants found something new in the chimney, a face burned into the blackened brick. It was not the boy's. Its mouth was open wide, teeth bared, eyes hollow, as if caught mid-scream. The widow ordered the hearth sealed, bricks laid thick and mortar wet. But the next morning the plaster cracked again, and from within faint whispers began, low rhythmic, calling names backward one after another, until it reached hers. She fell to her knees, trembling as her son watched from the doorway. "Don't you hear him, Mama?" he said. "The man in the smoke says we all have to listen." He smiled again, and this time, as the candlelight flickered across his face, the soot around his mouth looked almost like a second grin, burned into his skin. Outside, the magnolias rustled. The wind sighed down the chimney that should not have been open. And in the whisper of the smoke, the widow heard it, her own name, spoken backward, soft as a dying breath. The fire, though long dead, exhaled one last time, a faint puff of ash rising like laughter. Some say if you stand by the old fireplace of Cypress Hollow and listen long enough, you can still hear the boy counting the cracks in the wall, and between the numbers, a voice whispering names that were never meant to be spoken again. The oak had been there longer than the house itself. Its roots were deep, older than boundary lines, older than the names of the families that claimed the land. They said the first master chose that tree not for its strength, but for the sound it made when struck. Even in the stillest air it groaned. When the wind came, its branches sang like leather splitting the night. The servants called it the whipping tree. The master called it justice. But justice leaves marks, not only on the skin. In the dim hours before dawn, fog crawled through the cane fields. It wrapped around the oak like a shroud, heavy and damp. The scars in its bark glistened red, though no one had bled there for weeks. No one but old Isaac would go near it now. He said he heard something whispering in its roots when he passed. "Don't look," he muttered to the others. "It remembers the sound of pain." They laughed at first, but not after the first crow fell dead beneath its branches. When the master's eldest son, Thomas, returned from the city, he found the fields quiet. "Where are the workers?" he asked. "They keep to the cabins," said the overseer, eyes low. "They say the tree's been crying," Thomas scoffed. "A crying tree? Nonsense." But that night, as the storm rolled across the horizon, he went to see for himself. The fields shivered under the wind. The oak loomed ahead, black against the lightning. Its trunk was split and swollen, the bark etched in long, clean lines like scars that would never close. And there, in the hush between thunderclaps, one he heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like breath, like someone weeping into the soil. He drew closer, lantern held high. Something wet gleamed on the bark, not sap, not dew. It ran thick, red and slow, tracing the shape of an old lash mark. The wind shifted, the branches moved, and the sound that came from them was not quite the wind's. It cracked once, twice, sharp, deliberate, echoing across the fields like memory made sound. Thomas stumbled back, clutching his chest. A voice, faint and ragged, drifted between the leaves. "Do you remember the names?" The lantern flickered. "Do you remember the names?" Thomas turned, running hard through the mud, his boots slipping as lightning tore open the sky. Behind him the tree groaned, and something within it answered. By morning he was fevered. He claimed the tree spoke to him all night, that he'd seen faces in the bark, pressed deep like the memory of screams. His mother sat by his bed, pressing a cool rag to his brow. "You're dreaming, Thomas," she whispered. He turned toward her, eyes bloodshot, voice shaking. "No, Mama. It's not done with us. It says the lash still sings." The servant stopped going near the fields altogether. Every night the wind rose and the branches snapped in perfect rhythm. 11 strikes, then silence. Always 11. They said it matched the number of graves behind the house, the ones with no names. One morning, the master found Isaac standing beneath the tree, whispering prayers to the dirt. "Get away from there," he barked. Isaac didn't move. "The roots are moving," he said. "They're crawling." The master raised his cane. "You'll stop this foolishness." But then he saw it too, the ground bulging softly as if something beneath it turned and shifted. A low creak echoed up through the soil, and the air smelled suddenly of iron and smoke. He stepped back, trembling. "God help us," he whispered. That night, thunder broke the sky again. The tree's branches writhed against the wind, and from its base came a deep pulsing sound, like a heart beating too slow. Inside the manor, Thomas woke screaming. "They're in the fields," he cried. "They're standing by the tree." The servants rushed to the window, and there in the lightning's brief white glare they saw them, figures still, lined in a circle around the oak. Their faces were pale and wrong, blurred like wet paint. Their hands hung at their sides, limp and waiting. The next flash of lightning, and they were gone. Only the oak remained, its branches twisting in the wind like limbs trying to break free. By morning the roots had surfaced. They broke through the ground like knotted cords, curling toward the manor. One root reached the porch steps before anyone dared to touch it. When they cut it with an axe, it bled, thick black-red warm, and in the silence that followed, a voice carried from the fields, soft, cracked, almost tender, one for each lash. The master fell to his knees, muttering prayers no one could hear. He looked toward the house and saw the whip nailed to the door again, clean and glistening as if freshly oiled. By the third night no one slept. The wind never stopped. The branches never stilled. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like another strike, another echo from the oak. In his fevered state, Thomas rose from bed and stumbled into the storm. They found him at dawn, kneeling at the base of the tree, his hands pressed flat against its bark. His skin was cold, his mouth open, as though he'd been speaking when he froze. The bark beneath his palms had changed. 2 perfect handprints, dark and sunken, marked the wood, and the tree was quiet. For the first time in weeks, utterly still. They buried him that evening under the oak, at his mother's pleading. But when the wind rose again, the branches moved, slow, deliberate, and from their depths came a sound like breath drawn through teeth, a whisper. Low, rhythmic counting, 1, 2, 3, it stopped at 11. Then came the crack, sharp, clean, and final. The mother fell to her knees in the mud, her eyes wide with knowing. The whip song had ended. But the trees had only just begun, and so the servants still crossed themselves when the wind turned sharp and thin. For in the sound of the branches, that ancient measured rhythm, they hear the memory of every lash that ever struck the field. They say the tree feeds on it still, that if you stand too close you can hear your own name carved into the bark, waiting for the wind to find it. The house of the widow stood like a mausoleum at the edge of the cane fields, tall, hollow, and half swallowed by ivy. By day it was only quiet. By night it breathed. The servants swore the shutters moved without wind. They said the house listened. They said it mourned with her, and when the sun went down over Cypress Hollow, the fields turned black and the air turned heavy, as if even the land pitied her grief. The widow buried her last child beneath the magnolia at noon. No priest came. No hymns were sung. Just the slow creak of her mourning veil as she lowered her head, and the hiss of shovels breaking earth. They said she did not cry, but her shadow trembled as if it wanted to. When the grave was covered, she turned and walked back to the great house, her black skirts dragging through the dust. And as the front door shut behind her, the latch clicked like a lock on a tomb. She did not come out again. At night, the house began to speak. It started as faint murmurs in the upper rooms, sighs that might have been the shifting of the old wood. But then came the weeping, low at first, soft. A woman's sob muffled by walls too thick to hear through. Yet the servants in the quarters heard it clear, as if whispered in their ears. "It's the widow," one said. "She's lost her mind." But the others shook their heads. "No," said old Ruth, the cook. "That ain't her voice. Hers is low. This one's got sorrow older than she is." The next night the crying began again, and this time it came with words. Broken ones, half-formed, a lullaby with no tune. Inside the house the widow sat at her dressing table, a single candle burning beside her. The glass of the mirror was draped in black cloth, as was every mirror in the home. She dared not look into them any more. The crying drifted through the floorboards, distant like something buried alive. At first she tried to ignore it. She prayed aloud, though she could not remember the words. Then the crying grew louder. She rose and pressed her ear to the wall. "Who's there?" she whispered. The answer came like breath through old plaster. "Mama." Her hand froze. Her knees buckled. That voice was small, trembling. It was her boy's, but her boy was in the ground. At dawn she called for the servants. None came. The kitchen was empty, the halls bare. The house smelled faintly of iron and wet earth. She found one note on the front table, scrawled hastily in charcoal. "We can't stay, Mrs. It calls our names now." The candle beside the note had burned itself out, leaving a small pool of wax that gleamed red in the morning light. The widow tore the drapes from the windows, flooding the parlor with sunlight, desperate for the warmth, the life of it. But even then she heard it. Faint, almost tender, "Mama." It came not from the cellar nor the stairs, but from within the walls themselves. That night she refused to light a candle. A darkness, she thought, might keep her safe. She sat in the parlor, hands clasped tight, heart drumming in her chest. When the clock struck midnight, the air shifted. The boards beneath her chair creaked. Someone was walking above her. "Who's there?" she called. The footsteps stopped. Then from the ceiling a single drop of water fell, dark, thick and slow, landing on the back of her hand. It was warm. She looked up. A stain was spreading across the ceiling, the color of rust, and faintly from behind the walls the voice returned, softer now, pleading. "Mama, it's cold." She climbed the stairs with shaking hands, candle trembling in her grasp despite her vow to stay in the dark. Each step groaned under her weight. Each shadow shifted just out of reach. The nursery door stood open. Inside, the room was as she'd left it, untouched, frozen in time. A wooden horse lay on its side, a small quilt folded neatly on the bed, and on the wall above the cradle, something new. A smear, dark and uneven, traced the shape of a small handprint. Below it another, and another, until the wall was a constellation of reaching fingers, all pressed upward, as if trying to climb out. Her candle hissed. The flame flickered blue, the air thickened. The walls began to tremble. From the cradle came a faint rustle, as if something had shifted beneath the blanket. The widow's voice broke into a whisper. "Thomas?" No answer. Only the soft sound of breathing, not hers. She reached forward, pulling back the quilt. The cradle was empty, but the pillow bore the shape of a child's head, as though one had just risen from it. The weeping began again, closer now. It came from behind her, from the walls, from the very floor. The candle went out. In the darkness she heard small feet pattering across the boards. The nursery door creaked shut. "Mama?" She turned toward the sound, but there was no shape to see, only the faint outline of something moving in the dark, pacing the room. Every breath she took seemed to echo. Every heartbeat was answered by another, softer, slower. Then near her ear, "Why did you leave us there?" Her throat tightened. "I didn't." The air grew cold. Something brushed against her arm, a touch like damp earth. The whisper came again, fractured and full of sorrow. "We're still in the ground." By morning the house stood silent again. The servants, watching from the fields, saw no smoke rise from the chimneys. When at last they dared approach, they found the front door ajar. Inside, the parlor was soaked with water that smelled faintly of rot. The walls were cracked, as though something had tried to push its way out. And on the second floor the widow's room was empty, save for her black veil folded neatly on the bed. The window was open, and outside beneath the magnolia, the earth looked freshly turned. From the hollow beneath its roots came the sound of a woman weeping, soft, endless and echoing through the soil. They say that on still nights, when the moon is low and the magnolias bloom too early, you can hear her crying still, not for her children, but with them. And if you listen long enough, the voices join and smaller, fainter, until the whole hollow hums with grief that will not die. The widow's lament never ends. It only finds new walls to haunt. The rain fell sideways that night, hard, cold, and endless. It came down the way punishment does. Slow at first, then all at once. The hounds were the first to sense it. They began to howl long before the knock came at the great house door. Inside, the master sat alone by the fire. The whiskey glass in his hand had gone untouched for hours. The flames were low, but they burned with an unease that matched his own heartbeat. He had been listening, not to the rain, but to the faint sound beneath it. Something like a chain dragging through the mud. Something like footsteps returning from the grave. When the knock finally came, it wasn't loud. Just a single hollow thud, wood against wood. And yet it carried through the whole house, down the halls into the marrow of every servant still awake. He did not rise at first. He only stared into the fire. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice coarse from disuse. Silence. Then another knock. And this time a whisper followed it, rough, rasped, like wind through an open grave. "Master." "It's me." The door opened on its own. A figure stood in the threshold, drenched, shivering, and pale as the lightning that split the sky behind him. Mud streaked his boots to the knee. His clothes clung to his frame, heavy with rain and soil. The master squinted through the flicker of the firelight. "God help me," he breathed. "You were gone 3 nights." The overseer's eyes lifted, pale, glassy, unfocused. He did not blink. He looked like a man who'd seen something too terrible to describe, and had decided somewhere along the way to stop trying. "I buried it," he rasped. "Just like you said." The master's jaw tightened. He gestured toward the fire. "Come in before you freeze." The overseer did not move. "I buried it deep," he said again, voice cracking like dry wood. "But something dug it up." The master rose slowly, as if the room itself were pressing down on him. "What do you mean, dug it up?" The overseer's head turned toward the rain-dark fields beyond the house. His voice dropped lower. "I saw the hole. Saw the roots torn clean. The earth was open. Like a mouth." He took a step forward. "Something down there breathed, sir. I heard it." The soil moved. Lightning flashed, was brief and cruel, and for a moment, the master thought he saw it too. A wet streak down the overseer's sleeve, too dark for rain, too thick for mud. They stood in silence as thunder rolled through the hills. The master's gaze drifted to the corner of the room, to the place above the mantel where the whip had once hung. The leather had been old, blackened from years of use. He had told himself its removal would be enough to end the whispers. It hadn't. He poured another glass of whiskey, though his hand trembled. "Sit, Jacob," he said. "You're shaken. You need rest." But the overseer did not sit. He stared at the fire as though something inside it was calling his name. "Master," he whispered, "did you ever hear it?" The words froze the air between them. "What?" "The whip," Jacob said. "Before it struck, and it used to hum, like breath through a throat." His voice fell to a tremor. "And now, when the wind blows through the fields, I swear I hear it again." The master turned toward the window. The curtains swayed. The rain had stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was too still, like the pause before the first scream. Then came a sound from the porch, slow, steady, unmistakable. The dragging of something across the boards. The master's skin crawled. "Who's out there?" he barked. No answer. Jacob stepped closer to the door. His hand hovered over the latch, shaking. "Don't!" the master hissed. "Leave it." But Jacob's eyes had gone distant again, fogged with the same terror that had followed him through the storm. He turned the handle. The door creaked open, and there, lying across the threshold, was the whip. It glistened wet in the candlelight. Not with rain, but with something darker, thicker. The handle was slick. The leather coils twitched as though alive, curling slow as snakes. Jacob stumbled backward, crossing himself. "God have mercy," the master said nothing. His throat was dry. His mind screamed that it could not be, that he had seen it buried deep beneath the oak, sealed under stones and salt. But here it was. "Pick it up," he ordered. Jacob shook his head violently. "No, no, sir. I won't touch it again." "Do it," the master said. "Now." The overseer bent, trembling, his fingers brushing the leather, and the whip moved. It coiled around his wrist like it recognized him. Jacob screamed, clawing at it, but it tightened, slicing into his skin. The air filled with a sharp, low hum, a sound like teeth chattering in the bones of the earth. "Get it off," he cried. "It's burning!" The master grabbed a poker from the fire and swung. The metal struck the whip, sending sparks into the air, and the thing fell still. Jacob dropped to the floor, gasping. His arm was black where the whip had touched him. Veins turned to ash. The master stood over him, the poker glowing red in his hand. The whip lay motionless, its leather smoking faintly. Neither of them spoke. Then Jacob began to laugh, like a broken, wheezing sound that didn't belong to a sane man. "You can't kill it," he said. "You can't bury what remembers." "Enough," the master growled. But Jacob was still laughing. His eyes rolled back and blood trickled from his mouth. "It knows your name too," he whispered. "It said it in the dark." He slumped over, lifeless. The storm began again, but the rain didn't come from the sky. It came from the ceiling, drops of red falling onto the floorboards, spreading like ink. The master looked up, and there above him the beams were carved with words, not carved and burned. One word over and over, written in scorched black lines: "Repent, repent, repent." The master staggered backward, his hands shaking. Outside, the oak tree shuddered in the wind, its branches cracking in rhythm. Each snap echoed like a whip strike, and as he turned toward the door, he saw it. Through the window pane, through the storm, a figure standing in the field. Head bowed, hand raised, the whip curled at its feet, waiting. They said by dawn the overseer's body was gone, and the master's door was found hanging open, the floor soaked with rain and blood. The whip was gone too. Only the sound remained, that low, trembling hum that rolled through the cane fields long after the thunder faded, a hum that grew louder each time the wind passed over the old oak, and when it did, the earth seemed to breathe. The first to notice was the butler. He said the wallpaper moved, not peeled, not fluttered, moved like skin. At first the master laughed at him. "A house cannot breathe," he said, staring into his half-empty glass. But the butler didn't smile. He just looked toward the walls and whispered, "Then why does it have a heartbeat?" Cypress Hollow had gone still. After the overseer's return, and his vanishing, no servant dared cross the gate. The fields lay rotting, the air thick with the scent of iron and ash. Only the master remained in the great house. He told himself it was courage that kept him there, but even he knew it was guilt. Each night he felt it stronger, the stillness, the pulse beneath the boards. The rhythm came slow, steady, deliberate, like a buried heart that refused to stop beating. At times he pressed his palm to the wall just to prove it wasn't real, but every time the plaster was warm beneath his hand, and sometimes it moved. The windows no longer opened. The air inside the house had changed, thicker, heavier, humming faintly in the silence. The mirrors, long covered since the widow's sorrow, had begun to fog on their own. No candles burned near them, yet moisture bloomed on the glass like breath from unseen lips. The master had begun sleeping in the study, too afraid to climb the stairs. He would sit by the cold fireplace, clutching the poker, and watch the shadows stretch and contract along the walls. It was on one of those nights that he first heard it. A faint snap, a whisper through the walls. Then another. Then another. Rhythmic, wet, echoing. He froze. It wasn't the creak of the old wood, it wasn't the storm outside. It was a sound he knew too well. The sound of a whip cutting through air. He rose, breath shallow, and followed the sound down the corridor. Each step he took, the pulse grew louder, thudding beneath his feet, crawling up the baseboards, thrumming through the doorframes. At the end of the hall, the door to the parlor stood ajar. He hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. The air inside was heavy, humid, alive. The wallpaper bulged in and out, like lungs drawing breath. The chandeliers swayed, though there was no wind. And from somewhere deep within the walls came that faint, unmistakable rhythm. Snap, crack, snap. The master pressed his ear to the plaster. A whisper met him. Low, intimate, almost tender. Master. He stumbled back, eyes wide. The voice was familiar, rasping, hollow, wet. Jacob, the overseer. He fled to the foyer, gasping. The house seemed to exhale around him, doors creaking open, floorboards shifting under invisible weight. "Stop this!" he shouted. His words echoed back at him, stretched and twisted. "Stop this! Stop this! Stop this!" The echo didn't fade. It grew louder, until the house was whispering with him, 100 voices murmuring from inside its walls. Some were human, some were not. He clutched his head and staggered to the door. The handle burned hot under his grip, scalding his palm. He cried out and fell backward. When he looked up, he saw that the door wasn't wood anymore, it was flesh. Pale, veined, pulsing faintly under the lamplight. And in the center of it, where the keyhole had been, something dark began to open, slow and deliberate, like an eyelid. He ran. The hallways stretched longer than they ever had. The portraits lining the walls had changed, faces blurred, eyes melted into hollow sockets. He passed the old mirror by the staircase, its shroud half fallen away. For the first time in months, he saw his reflection. And behind him in the reflections room, the walls were covered in hands, hundreds of them, a small, large, black, white, pressing outward from within, fingertips pushing through the wallpaper. The walls themselves bulged and heaved, clawing for air. He turned, and there was nothing. Just still, lifeless plaster. But when he looked back at the mirror, the hands were closer. One reached for his throat. He smashed the glass with his fist, shattering the reflection. The pieces scattered like sharp stars across the floor. And from beneath them faintly came a whispering chorus, "Breathe with us." By morning the air had gone still again. He woke in his chair, unsure whether the night had been dream or delirium. But when he stood, the floor pulsed beneath him, slow, deep, and steady. He followed it, step by step, into the cellar. The air grew damp, then hot, and the deeper he went, the louder the sound became. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heartbeat. Louder now, real. At the far end of the cellar, the earth bulged upward, as though something beneath it was alive. He knelt beside it, pressing a trembling hand to the dirt. It was warm. He began to dig. The soil was wet and dark, slick between his fingers. The smell of rot filled the air, and then his hand struck something soft. He brushed away the earth and found fabric, old, torn, soaked through. He pulled harder, and something came loose with it. Leather, black, cracked, coiled, and the whip. Its handle gleamed faintly red, as though it still remembered the heat of blood. The master staggered backward, choking on the stench. The heartbeat grew wild now, shaking the cellar walls. The whip twitched. He turned to flee, but the stairs were gone. The doorway had sealed behind him, covered in pulsing, living flesh. He spun back, staring at the whip as it began to uncoil. It moved like a serpent, slow and graceful, its tip dragging through the wet earth. The hum returned, low, guttural, vibrating through his bones. He covered his ears, but it was inside him now, inside the walls, inside the house. He could hear the whisper of every soul it had ever touched. Slaves, servants, children, their voices layered, crying, whispering, praying. And beneath them all, his own. He fell to his knees, clawing at his ears, his throat raw from silent screams. The air was thick, suffocating, the ceiling dripped. The floor rose and fell with every heartbeat, until the whole house seemed to inhale once deep and long, and exhale with a sound like a dying sigh. The candle went out. When the servants returned weeks later, the house stood silent. Its walls were cool, its rooms empty. But if one pressed their ear to the floor, they swore they could hear it, faint, steady, eternal. A heartbeat, slow and patient. And on still nights, when the wind passed over Cypress Hollow, the house sighed again as though it remembered, as though it was waiting, as though it was still alive. The house that breathed had finally learned to whisper. The morning began with the smell of iron. It clung to the mist, heavy and metallic, long before the servants found the thing nailed to the front door. The plantation had been silent for weeks. The fields lay dead, the windows were sealed. But that dawn, the stillness broke, with a sound like a single hammer striking wood. And when the first rays of light touched the house, they revealed it, the whip coiled against the door like a serpent caught mid-strike, its handle glistening with something that was not due. It pulsed faintly, as if remembering its last breath. The butler, the only man still loyal enough to remain, was the first to see it. He fell to his knees, mumbling prayers that dissolved into sobs. The master came moments later, pale, sleepless, trembling behind his cane. "Who did this?" he demanded. But his voice was weak, hollow, like wind through an empty grave. The butler only pointed. Gad, the nail long blackened, forged from a shape once holy. It was unmistakable, and the cross that hung over the chapel door melted and reshaped into a single cruel spike. Its head still bore the faint outline of the crucifix, warped and screaming. The master's breath hitched. Who would dare desecrate the cross? The butler's eyes flicked upward. Sir, perhaps it wasn't a man who did. They tried to remove it. 3 men together, tugging, prying, sweating beneath the weight of invisible eyes. But the nail did not move. The wood groaned, the door splintered, and still it held, like bone refusing to break. By noon, the men had given up. The master ordered them away, muttering that he would handle it himself. He waited until dusk. The light bled red through the magnolia trees, and the air turned thick and wet. Trembling with distant thunder, he approached the door alone. The whip glistened now, not with rain, but with something warmer, darker. A faint trail of red dripped down the wood, pooling at the threshold. He reached out. The handle was slick, alive. It pulsed once beneath his touch, like a vein full of breath. He recoiled, cursing under his breath. Behind him the wind rose. It hissed through the fields, bending the grass in a single direction, toward the house, as if the land itself was watching. Inside, the candles flickered out. The hearth died, though no hand touched it, and from beyond the door came a sound, faint, deliberate, rhythmic, tap, 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 like fingers drumming on wood. The master froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound grew louder. He turned back toward the door, every instinct screaming to flee. But something deeper, whether pride or madness, and held him still. Who's there? No answer. Only the whisper of the wind, curling through the crack beneath the door. Then another sound, low, wet, a dragging whisper. The whip moved. It shifted against the wood. the coils unwinding with slow grace. Its tip traced a line across the door, a perfect, deliberate circle, before falling still again. The master stumbled backward, heart pounding. He stared at it, waiting. Nothing. But when he blinked and the door was different, the wood around the nail had darkened, warped, and beneath the whip's handle, the grain had begun to swell outward, forming the faint outline of something human, a face, mouth open, silent, screaming. That night, the storm broke. The house trembled under the weight of the wind, the rain slashing against the shutters like claws. The master sat awake, unable to tear his eyes from the door. The servants had all fled by then. Only the butler remained, pale as candle wax, whispering psalms under his breath. "Sir," he murmured, "that nail, it wasn't forged by any blacksmith I know." The master's gaze didn't waver. "What are you saying?" The butler swallowed. "They say the cross was taken the night before the storm, but no one saw who took it, and yet—" The chapel bell rang twice. The master frowned. "There's no bell rope anymore." The butler nodded slowly. "Aye, but there's wind enough in hell to ring it." At midnight, lightning struck the magnolia tree outside. Its branches burst into flame, white and silent. No thunder followed. The master rose, cane trembling in his grip. He walked to the door, drawn like a moth to the heartbeat that now pulsed faintly from the wood. It was beating. Slow, measured, like the pulse of something waiting to be born. He reached for the whip again. And this time it moved toward him. The leather slithered down, coiling around his wrist. Tight, deliberate. He gasped, trying to tear free, but the thing tightened, its texture changing under his skin. It wasn't leather anymore. It was flesh, warm, living flesh, he screamed, slamming his body against the door. The nail quivered, the air humming with a terrible sound, a deep, vibrating hum, like the echo of a buried choir. The whip's handle pulsed once, twice, and then went still, and from within the door came a voice, low, familiar. "Master." He froze. His breath turned to ice. The voice spoke again, wet, broken, trembling with laughter. "You buried me deep." The master's knees gave out. He fell to the floor, clutching his chest as the door began to bleed. Dark rivulets seeping from the cracks, trailing down to pool around his boots. "Jacob," he whispered. "Deeper," the voice hissed. "You thought the earth would keep me." The nail shuddered, glowing faintly red as if lit from within. And then the whip tightened, dragging the master's arm upward, pinning his palm flat against the door. The voice laughed softly. One nail wasn't enough for him. The master screamed as the nail tore free and plunged through his hand. The sound that followed wasn't human, a howl of storm and steel echoing through the hollow. Then, silence. By dawn, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of metal and fire. The door still stood, silent and blackened. But the whip was gone. Only the nail remained, buried deep, holding a single torn scrap of flesh against the wood. The servants who found it fled the house before sunset. And though no one dared enter again, travelers passing through the hollow swore they heard something when the wind changed direction, a faint, steady hammering, as if someone inside was still working to hang another nail. They say the earth can remember sin, and in the hollow where the plantation once stood, the soil remembers everything. No grass grows there now, only dust the color of ash and bones too small to name. The air never warms even under summer skies. The crows do not circle. The rain never lingers. It is a place abandoned not by time but by light itself. They call it the field that forgot the sun. Once it was a place of green and gold. Cotton stretched to the horizon, bending beneath the sun like a sea of silk. The wind moved through it like breath, gentle, measured, alive. Now there is only stillness, and the wind carries a different sound, a slow, steady crack that rises and falls with every gust. At first travelers think it's thunder, but thunder does not weep. The few who have stood there long enough say it sounds like a whip striking air, soft, distant and endless. Others claimed to hear something beneath it, a voice too faint to catch, murmuring names the land itself has not forgiven. The master's house is gone now. The fire that took it left nothing but blackened stone, and a staircase that leads nowhere. Yet the ground still breathes. Stand long enough upon it and you will feel it. A faint shiver as though something just beneath the surface is shifting in its sleep. The locals warn not to linger. They say every few decades the land remembers the last night. The night when the fields burned, and the master's sins finally reached the sky. That night began with silence. No wind, no crickets, no sound of beasts in the woods. Only a strange, heavy air, thick with the scent of iron and rot. The widow was the first to see it. She stood at her window, veil drawn tight, and watched as the horizon flickered with light. Not lightning, not lanterns, but fire, deep in the soil, crawling upward like veins. She whispered a name then, one she had not spoken since her last child's funeral. And when she looked again, the flames had begun to take shape. Figures walked in the fire. Not shadows, but outlines. Men and women rising from the rows of earth, their faces hidden, their steps slow, deliberate. The fields themselves seemed to open, releasing every buried memory. Ashes turned to limbs. Roots became fingers. And through it all came that sound, the endless, merciless crack. It echoed across the hollow like judgment. By dawn the house had burned to its foundations. The master's blood, if blood it was, most soaked into the soil, feeding a hunger long held at bay. The wind did not blow for 7 days. The sky hung low, bruised purple, as though mourning. Then the change came. The grass turned grey. The trees twisted inward, their bark splintering with black veins. And when the first rains returned, the drops that struck the ground hissed as if falling upon coals. Nothing grew again. The plantation's name was erased from every record, every map. Those who lived near it moved away. And still, on some nights, the air trembles with that steady rhythm, that sound that once ruled the fields. Crack, crack, crack. A century later, a man came walking through the hollow. He was a scholar, or so he said, drawn by the stories, the whispers, the superstition. He carried books, ink, and a mind full of disbelief, the kind of man who thought ghosts were only stories told by the poor to make sense of cruelty. He camped near the old oak, what the elders once called the whipping tree. There was nothing left of it but a stump, black as coal, the shape of the bark almost smooth, as if the years had polished it. That night he wrote his notes. He spoke aloud, dictating to the empty dark. An exaggeration, perhaps. The air carries echoes of the wind, mistaken for human sound. The red soil is iron-rich, giving the illusion of blood when wet. Nothing supernatural, only memory. He closed his book and smiled at his own cleverness, but the wind did not agree. It began as a sigh, soft and low. Then it rose, gathering weight and voice. The fire in his lantern flickered and died, leaving him in perfect blackness. And in that blackness came the sound, it faint at first, then closer. Crack, he froze. The sound came again, crack. The earth beneath him shuddered. His breath clouded the air, though the night was warm. Then from somewhere behind him, a voice hoarse and calm, "Count if you can." He turned, but there was no one there. Only the hollow shape of the stump, faintly glistening as though wet. He stepped closer, and in the lantern's dying ember, he saw something pressed into the wood. Dozens of small, shallow grooves, each one curved and deliberate. Letters. He brushed his hand over them. The wood was warm. The name carved there was his own. He stumbled back, heart hammering, breath sharp. The sound came again, closer now, directly behind him. Crack. The whip he could not see tore through the air, grazing his shoulder. He felt nothing at first, then warmth, then pain. When he looked down, the sleeve of his coat was cut clean through, and his skin bled in a perfect line. He ran, but the field shifted beneath him, the dust clinging to his boots like hands. He heard them all around. Whispers carried on the wind, repeating his name in voices not alive. When he looked back, he saw the stump was gone. In its place rose the shadow of the old tree, its branches swaying though there was no wind. And hanging from one branch, pale and glimmering, was a length of leather, wet, pulsing, alive. The air cracked again, and again, and again, until his screams joined the wind. Now the locals say the field took him, that it feeds on those who come seeking proof, that the soil drinks arrogance as greedily as it once drank blood. No one walks there now, not the living at least. On moonless nights, if you stand at the edge of that hollow, you might see the earth shimmer, faintly red as if lit from beneath. And if you listen closely beyond the wind, you might hear the whisper that ends the story of every trespasser. Count if you can. Then comes the sound, the only thing that still moves in that barren place. Crack, crack, crack. By dawn, the field lies silent again. No footprints remain. No sun breaks through. Only the dust, grey and endless, shifting like breath over the land that forgot how to grow. And when the wind rises once more, it carries with it that single note of penance, a whisper that has never stopped, the sound of a whip that remembers every sin it ever struck.